everybody. We're back with another Ramp Careers Daily Update. I'm joined with both co-founders today, Mitch and Manoj. Fellas, another Monday. We've made it back to the Monday. How you doing?
Doing good, Danny. Doing good.
Another Monday, Danny. Excited to be back here again with both of you. And it's a bit of a rainy day here today, but the week's looking brighter. So looking forward to it.
It was very positive, Manoj. I like that. I like that attitude.
Let's talk about money. I know that you were shooting the breeze before we started hit record here, but one of my favorite topics, something that we always wish we had more of, but when we do have a bit of it, we don't know what to do with it. I don't think that there's a lot of help that's out there, a lot of resources. They're out there, I guess, but not like specifically for folks that are starting out their first job. And let's call it sales, right? It's interesting because you get a base salary, you get a bit of a bonus. For most people, it's probably the most money that they've made ever, especially if they're starting their first job out of college. But depending on where you live, expenses could be high. I know, Mitch, you had moved out of the comfort of North Carolina and decided to move to New York City, where I'm sure everything costs twice as much. And I think it'll be a nice topic to kind of dive in a little bit and see how you guys went about, specifically, Mitch, I'm most curious about you because I think you're probably a little bit closer to that than Danny and I are.
Yeah, I was poor.
What was your thinking? I remember you eating like a lot of oats and cooking a lot. I used to give you shit for it, but I also forgot, how difficult it must have been to move into a new city and try to acclimate with the surroundings. How was your first year like, and what did you plan for this at all?
I was living at home with my parents after graduating from UNC in North Carolina. Had about 3 months of rent saved up for if I wanted to move to New York City. So I moved to New York on a whim and started interviewing. And I got down to like 1 month left in rent and luckily got a job at YayPay. And yeah, it was tough. It was super tough. I was making $40,000 at YayPay, startup, no commission, or I guess technically there was like a commission structure, but we never got paid out on commissions in the early days. I mean, that was like, we all forfeited it so that the startup could continue to survive month after month. Eventually we got there, but yeah, it's really tough. I think a lot of folks might not be in that type of situation, but some may. I mean, you nailed it, right? Coming out of school, in my opinion, being an SDR and getting into sales is one of the most lucrative positions you can get with limited technical experience. Obviously, you could go into like engineering, be a developer, but that requires more technical experience. You could go into banking and finance, a little bit more technical experience, and let's just face it, like it's a grueling, hard job. I mean, Manoj, you went that route. You can talk about that all day long. But being in sales SDR, you can come out of any major, graduate from any degree. As long as you're willing to hustle and you can talk to people, you can make it in that career. And you can be making upwards of $80,000 a year your first year out of school. I mean, it's not crazy to see SDRs making $100K. It is really impressive. I think we should talk about what you do with your money. For me personally, all my money went towards rent, basically. That's why I was eating beans and oatmeal for lunch every day. And Manoj was bullying me. No, just kidding. Manoj took me to mini lunches and was very grateful, but still bullied me. You got to be smart, and we can get into this a little bit, right? But it was rent first. Second was, me and my girlfriend at the time, Allie and I would splurge on dinners on Saturday nights. Other than that, we made every meal in, brought my own lunches. It's tough, especially moving to a new city.
And Danny, when you moved to New York City, like what, and I know that you kind of started out on a similar structure. I'm sure there was like a base and a variable comp. How did you budget for it? Did you budget, or when you were thinking about a place to stay, what was the number in the back of your mind? Was it like your OTE, or did you center everything on your base and then not really bring up the commissions into calculation? Because it's a decision you have to make, right? I mean, you sign into a lease, and how did both of you kind of make that decision? Stay with roommates as well. And that's another big city construct.
I actually started up in Chicago. I led the Groupon City for New York from Chicago, but dude, it was tough. So I moved to Chicago. Like Mitch, I was in my parents' basement for the first 4 months. Well, after the first 3 months of working at a summer camp where I made peanuts, I was at my parents' house for 4 months where I took the LSAT, didn't really have a job, was a law clerk, and made near minimum wage. So I had saved up, I want to even say like maybe $5,000 for rent. And naturally, my first job was an unpaid sales internship in Chicago. So I didn't budget anything. I was pretty terrified because not only was I not getting paid, but my only path to getting any sort of income was to get off this internship and start making sales at Groupon. Fortunately, that happened within 6 weeks, and I, was able to make rent work. But in the beginning, Groupon paid us a $32,500 base. And when commissions were paid, they're paid once a month. My first couple commission checks were really pretty meaningless. So I was pretty worried for a while. Like Mitch, all my money was going to rent. Then when I figured out how to sell and how to make money, and that it was achievable and attainable, I started just putting all of my money into a savings account, because that's what I've been told, by my parents or by my grandparents or throughout my whole life, that's where you should put your money. I realized pretty quickly that I wasn't making any yield or interest on it. And I realized it, a little later than I wanted to. But what I did back in the day was I dedicated a certain amount of money to rent, make sure that was covered, a certain more to my spending or fun account. And then most of it would go either into a long-term investing account or into my savings account, one or the other. Savings account was not to be touched. Long-term investing account was also not to be touched. For the first few years, let's call it the first 6 years after school, I also lived with a roommate for a few reasons, socially, obviously, but keeping the cost down in a relatively expensive city. Chicago was far less expensive than San Francisco. When I lived in San Francisco, I definitely needed a roommate because it's super expensive out here.
What are some other hacks to save money? So roommate's like one of the obvious ones, right? Immediately cuts your rent in half, and you can get a pretty solid place once you get one or two roommates. What are some other hacks that you guys use on a daily basis to save money?
I was on my parents' health insurance plan. I mean, I know not everyone may have the luxury of doing that, but thanks to Obamacare, up until I was 26, I milked that plan for as long as I could, because my sister was still on the plan, and I don't think incrementally it cost my dad as much, or if anything. And instead, what I had considered asking or considered negotiating for as long as I could do that when I was on someone else's plan was say, hey, if you're not paying towards my health insurance premium, could I instead get a gym membership? See if folks would cover that. And I think it's a reasonable question to ask. I mean, someone may or someone may not, but if that's something that you value and it's health oriented, why not try and get it? So that's one thing that I think was doable for sure. And I live with my parents, man. I lived with my parents for the first, I'd say, year and a half after I took my first job. And quite honestly, I was able to pay off a chunk of pretty much all of my first year law school costs, mostly from money that I'd saved just by living at home. I mean, I didn't have much of a romance life, but that's okay. I think it's a reasonable trade-off. Not that I would have anyways. And so
it worked out.
Pre-Tinder.
That's something that I did. Would you guys recommend like a side hustle? I know that there's like so much talk these days, especially today more so than any other day, right? It's so easy for someone to say, all right, I'm going to set up a side hustle. I see a lot of it out there. Would you recommend that someone in the year one or, take another job to try and make extra cash?
Yeah, I mean, if it's something aside from your day-to-day and you feel like you can systematically attack your day job, go above and beyond, exceed expectations, especially in sales, if you're hitting your quota or going above your quota, a side hustle is okay. I think that's reasonable. If you're struggling though, you should really balance, is this the right thing to be doing right now, given one, you like your job or given that it's the right career choice for you, and two, thinking through the long-term impact of underperforming at a company where you're surrounded by folks that you may interact with and come up against in the future. So, side hustle, I think generally great, awesome. I'm excited for people that want to do side hustles. And I think, frankly, I do a bunch of side hustles. So I think it's awesome, but not at the expense of your core responsibilities. One thing I did while I was on my sales internship, my unpaid sales internship at Groupon, and for the first, call it 6 months of my real job, is I actually would make my own meals each day and bring it to the office. Generally, I cook the same thing every day at lunch to keep it easy for myself, and would just pack a little lunch in a Tupperware, keep it in the fridge, and then keep costs down. Obviously, when you're working with a bunch of coworkers, it's easy to go out to lunch every day. And obviously, there's a social element to that too. I was really mindful of my costs, especially before I figured out how to actually earn commission. To keep costs down, making your own lunch was a very easy way to do so.
Thinking about food, the other side of that is drinking also. Going out on the weekend, you can spend so much money at bars, especially in a big city. I remember going to New York City and buying like a Bud Light for $8. I was like, where am I? This is insane. Coming from North Carolina, you get them like for 50 cents on a Tuesday night. My biggest hack was just drinking at home and then going to the bars to hang out. That you'll save a fortune, honestly. That's like a classic college hack there, but especially moving into a big city, it can be 4 or 5 times what you're expecting.
Mitch, I remember particularly when we were in San Francisco and going through 500 that we would show up for every free meal, man. I mean, how many we spent not as much on food. Most of it was either from raiding the fridge and just eating those eggs that were there, going to every free event. I think we've kind of hacked that too.
If you can find a startup that offers meals in any capacity, that's a huge win. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, whatever it is, scavenger off of other companies like Manoj and I did.
But I mean, I think the gist is definitely a plan to live on your base if possible within reason, and try to save your commissions or put it towards better use, knowing full well that you may end up in a circumstance where you may have to be in transition and where you may have to have a little bit of a nest egg. I think it's a little bit easier when you're younger. You can rely on family. As you get older, it gets a little bit difficult to be able to impose the same burden as you can possibly get away with when you're younger. Taking care of health too, I think that's another thing that I strongly recommend. Healthcare is something that it's inexpensive. You don't have to see a doctor. You can do whatever you want up until the point something goes wrong. And then it just becomes an incredible expense that's going to follow you for the rest of your life. And so, there's certainly things you can control. But, it's one of the things that I'm in good health today, but one of the things that I wish that I did more of was, maybe be a little more intense when I was exercising when I was younger, be a little more active, mostly because it'll pay dividends later on. And, you perform better at work too. So even if you have a stressful day, find avenues to work out. I think it's a replacement too, because quite honestly, like the gym kind of took off hours out of my day where I would replace that with some other social activity. And sometimes, Mitch, I mean, for you and I, that became a bit of a social activity. I remember that's what we used to do, because if that's not it, then we're out there doing something else and probably spending money because we have time. I think those are the things that come like to the top of my mind, assuming that, you're not encumbered with other obligations like having to take care of another family member. If that's the case, I don't know if I'm certainly not qualified to give a lot of advice, but if it's just you and you're fending for yourself, congrats on landing a job and you're in a great place. Just make some smart decisions so you don't have to be stressed out later on.
Cool. So we gave you some tidbits today. Probably touch on this again as we talk about, how to be healthy at work and how to plan for the future, especially as you're ramping up to getting promoted. But for Mitch and Manoj, this has been Danny with another Ramp Careers Daily Update. All right. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. See ya.
Peace.